Have you ever wondered how deeply rooted prejudices can turn even the most ordinary moments into life-changing events? Today, we're diving into a story that shakes the core of justice, humanity, and power. This is the tale of Angela Carter, a brilliant federal judge who faced humiliation, suspicion, and injustice, not because of what she did, but because of what she looked like. Her courage and determination to challenge the system will leave you inspired, enraged, and ready to demand change. But before we dive in, if this story stirs something inside you, if it moves your heart or opens your mind, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Together, we can shed light on stories that matter and push for a world that listens, learns, and grows. Now, here's a glimpse of what's to come. Angela Carter, a black woman and federal judge, is accused of a crime she didn't commit, simply for trying to retrieve her belongings from her car. The situation escalates when a racist police officer decides to judge her not by her words, but by his own biases. What happens next will shock you, but it will also show the strength of a person unwilling to back down. Angela Carter was running late. Her usual poised demeanor was replaced by hurried steps and darting eyes as she searched her car for her purse. It was one of those days where every second mattered. As she leaned into her vehicle, rifling through papers on the passenger seat, a shadow fell across her. "Ma'am, step away from the car," barked a voice. Angela looked up to see a tall, stern-faced officer standing a few feet away. His hand rested on his holstered weapon. The urgency in her day collided head-on with the reality of being a black woman in America. "Officer, is there a problem?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "License and registration." Now. His tone was sharp, devoid of courtesy or explanation. Angela frowned. "I'm not driving the car. It's parked. I'm just trying to find my—" "I said now," he interrupted, stepping closer. Angela's heart sank. She had dealt with attitudes like his before, the immediate suspicion, the dismissive tone, but she was a federal judge. Surely once she explained, this misunderstanding would end. "Officer, my name is Angela Carter. I'm a federal judge. Yeah, and I'm the president," he scoffed. "Stop playing games and show me some ID." Angela paused, holding her hands up. "I'm telling you the truth. I can't find my purse, but if you check—" "Hands behind your back," he shouted, pulling out handcuffs. "Excuse me?" Angela blinked, bewildered. "You're under arrest for attempted vehicle theft," he snapped, grabbing her arm. Angela's breath caught in her throat. This couldn't be happening. Not to her. Not after everything she'd achieved. "Officer, this is a mistake," she protested as the cold steel of the cuffs locked around her wrists. "Tell it to the judge," he muttered. Angela's mind raced. She was the judge, but in that moment it didn't matter. To him, she was just another black woman who must be guilty of something. The situation escalates as Angela is taken to the station, where her words fall on deaf ears. But how do you maintain dignity when your authority is dismissed? What happens when a system built to protect you becomes the very thing that threatens you? Keep watching, because Angela's battle has only just begun. The drive to the station was suffocating. Angela Carter, a woman who had presided over countless cases, now sat in the back of a patrol car, her wrists aching from the cuffs that were far too tight. The officer, whose nameplate read Reynolds, didn't say much. His silence wasn't the neutral kind. It was heavy, judgmental, and laced with the kind of disdain Angela had seen far too often in her life. When they arrived at the station, Officer Reynolds opened the door brusquely. "Out," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Angela stepped out carefully, mindful of the stares from officers and civilians milling about. Inside, the atmosphere was no better. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a harsh glow on the rows of desks and filing cabinets. Reynolds led her to a processing desk, where another officer barely glanced up. "Name?" he asked in a monotone. "Angela Carter," she replied, her voice steady despite the humiliation brewing inside her. The officer paused, finally looking at her. "Carter, huh? You don't look like an Angela Carter to me." Angela held back a sigh. She'd heard variations of that line before. What did he expect her to look like? Reynolds handed over a hastily written report. "Caught her trying to break into a car," he said, ignoring Angela's glare. "Didn't have ID on her." Angela spoke up. "I already explained I'm a federal judge. My ID is in my purse, which is inside that car. Check the license plate. The registration is under my name." The officer behind the desk smirked. "A federal judge, huh? Sure, and I'm the Chief Justice. A wave of heat flushed through Angela's body. She clenched her fists, the cuffs biting into her skin. You can verify it easily, she said firmly, her tone carrying the authority she'd worked years to command. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking you to do your job. But they didn't. Instead, Angela was led to a holding cell, where she sat on a cold metal bench. The sound of the door locking behind her was a sound she'd heard many times before, but always from the other side. Now, it felt like the ultimate betrayal. Hours passed, and no one came to check on her. The cell smelled of damp concrete and stale sweat, a stark contrast to the polished chambers she was used to. Every so often, she'd hear laughter from the officers outside. Were they laughing at her? At the absurdity of a black woman claiming to be a federal judge? Her thoughts drifted to the courtroom. She thought of the young black men she'd sentenced, sometimes harshly, always by the book, and wondered if this was how they'd felt. Powerless, stripped of dignity, judged before a single word could be spoken in their defense. Angela tried once more to catch someone's attention. "Officer!" she called out, her voice firm but polite. A younger officer glanced her way but quickly looked back at his computer screen. "Officer?" she repeated, louder this time. Finally, Reynolds appeared, leaning against the bars with a smug grin. "What? Judge Carter needs room service?" Angela met his gaze, unflinching. "I need a phone call. Now." Reynolds tilted his head, feigning thought. "What's the rush? Your case won't come up for a while. Sit tight." Angela's frustration boiled over. "This is unlawful detention. You've refused to verify my identity and you've ignored every attempt I've made to explain myself. I know my rights. Now get me a phone." Reynolds' smirk faltered for a moment, but he recovered quickly. "Fine," he said, pulling a phone from his belt. "Make it quick." Angela dialed a number she knew by heart. Ethan Scott, her trusted attorney and longtime friend, answered on the second ring. "Angela? What's going on?" His voice was laced with concern. "I've been arrested," she said, her voice calm despite the chaos around her. "What?" Ethan's shock was palpable. "Where are you? Who arrested you? On what grounds?" "I'm at the 14th precinct. They accused me of trying to steal my own car. The officer refuses to verify my identity." "Stay put," Ethan said, his voice hardening. "I'm on my way." Angela handed the phone back to Reynolds, who didn't bother hiding his annoyance. "Happy now?" he muttered as he walked away. Angela returned to the bench, her mind racing. She wasn't just fighting for her own dignity anymore. This wasn't just about one officer's prejudice. This was about a system that allowed people like him to operate unchecked, and she intended to make sure it never happened again. Ethan Scott is on his way, and he's not coming quietly. But will Angela's attorney be able to cut through the layers of bias and bureaucracy? And what will happen when the truth about Angela's identity comes to light? The confrontation is brewing, and it's one you won't want to miss. Stay tuned. The quiet tension of the station shattered when Ethan Scott walked through the door. He was a man of commanding presence, dressed sharply in a tailored suit that seemed to amplify his authority. His piercing gaze swept the room, landing on Officer Reynolds. "I'm here for Angela Carter," Ethan said, his voice firm and clear. The other officers in the room exchanged uneasy glances, clearly caught off guard by his presence. Reynolds stepped forward, crossing his arms. "And you are?" "Ethan Scott, attorney at law," Ethan replied, holding up his credentials for everyone to see. "And you're going to release my client immediately." Reynolds let out a dry laugh. "Your client?" "She was caught breaking into a car. We don't release criminals on demand." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. "Criminal? The woman you've detained is Angela Carter, a federal judge. Did you bother to check her credentials? Or did you just assume she was guilty because of the color of her skin?" Reynolds flinched, but quickly masked his discomfort with a scoff. "We treat everyone the same here." "That's the problem," Ethan shot back, his voice rising. "You shouldn't treat everyone the same if your treatment is based on racial bias and ignorance." "Now, where is she?" Reynolds hesitated, clearly wrestling with whether to assert his authority or back down. Before he could respond, the station's captain, Chief Johnson, emerged from an office in the back. His expression was a mixture of curiosity and concern. "What's going on here?" Johnson asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Ethan turned to him, his demeanor instantly shifting from combative to professional. "Chief Johnson, I presume. I'm Ethan Scott, attorney for Angela Carter. She's being unlawfully detained by your officers. and I demand her immediate release." The chief frowned. "Angela Carter? The judge?" Ethan nodded. "That's correct. And your officers have not only failed to verify her identity, but they've also subjected her to degrading treatment based on nothing more than baseless assumptions." Johnson's face darkened. "Reynolds," he said sharply, "is this true?" Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "She didn't have ID on her, and she was acting suspicious." "That's enough," Johnson interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned to Ethan. "I'll handle this. Follow me." Angela looked up as the cell door opened, revealing Chief Johnson and Ethan. Relief washed over her at the sight of her attorney, but she remained composed. Dignity was her armor, even in moments like these. "Judge Carter," Johnson began, his tone apologetic, "I'm deeply sorry for this situation. You'll be released immediately." Angela stood slowly, her gaze steady. "Apologies are not enough, Chief. I expect accountability." "Of course," Johnson replied, nodding. "We'll investigate this thoroughly. Officer Reynolds will face disciplinary action if any misconduct is confirmed." Angela raised an eyebrow. I think the facts speak for themselves." Ethan stepped forward. "Chief, with all due respect, this isn't just about one officer. This is about systemic failure. Angela's rights were ignored at every step. How do you plan to address that?" Johnson hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Let's start by ensuring Judge Carter's immediate release. Then we can discuss reforms." Angela crossed her arms. "No, Chief. We'll discuss them now. I've spent my career upholding the law, and I know how easily promises of reform are swept under the rug. What happened to me is a symptom of a larger disease within this department." Reynolds appeared in the doorway, his face a mixture of defiance and fear. Angela turned to him, her voice calm but cutting. "Officer Reynolds, do you understand what you've done? You saw a black woman near a car and assumed she was a criminal. You ignored my words, dismissed my identity, and treated me as less than human. That's not law enforcement. It's prejudice." Reynolds opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The weight of her words and the reality of his actions left him speechless. Angela continued, "This isn't just about me. How many others have you treated this way? How many people's lives have you upended because of your biases? You may not see it, but your actions are part of a much larger problem." Johnson stepped in. "Judge Carter, I assure you, we'll take this matter seriously. Officer Reynolds will be placed on immediate leave while we investigate." Ethan, standing beside Angela, folded his arms. "That's a start, but it's far from enough. The confrontation at the station sets the stage for deeper accountability. As Angela prepares to hold the department to its promises, tensions rise. Will Chief Johnson follow through on his commitments, or will the system once again protect its own? And how will Angela use this moment to spark real, lasting change? The next chapter of this story is just beginning. Don't miss it. Angela Carter wasn't the kind of person to leave a situation unresolved. Her years on the bench had taught her that apologies without action were little more than empty words. So, after being released from her unjust detainment, she didn't just walk out of the precinct. She demanded a meeting with Chief Johnson and his senior officers. The meeting took place the very next morning in a sterile conference room at the station. Angela, dressed sharply in a navy suit that commanded respect, walked in with Ethan Scott by her side. Chief Johnson was already seated, looking uneasy, flanked by two senior officers and an administrative representative. Officer Reynolds was notably absent, likely sidelined pending the investigation. Angela began without hesitation. "Chief Johnson, thank you for meeting with me. However, let me be clear, this conversation isn't about me. It's about the systemic failures within this department that allow officers like Reynolds to abuse their power unchecked." Johnson nodded solemnly. "Judge Carter, I completely understand your frustration. Let me assure you." Angela cut him off. "With respect, Chief, you don't understand my frustration. What happened to me is the result of biases that have festered in law enforcement for decades. I want to know how you plan to address this, not just for me, but for every person in this community who has suffered at the hands of officers acting on prejudice." Ethan leaned forward, his voice sharp and measured. "Chief, we're not here for reassurances. We're here for accountability. Let's start with the basics. Why didn't Officer Reynolds verify Angela's identity before arresting her? That's standard protocol, isn't it?" Johnson sighed heavily. "It is, yes, and I can't excuse his failure to follow that protocol. We've already placed him on administrative leave while we conduct a thorough investigation." Angela raised an eyebrow. "Administrative leave? That's a vacation, Chief, not accountability. One of the senior officers shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Judge Carter, these processes take time. We have to follow union guidelines and meanwhile, Angela interrupted, her voice unwavering, how many more people will be subjected to the same treatment I endured? How many officers in this department operate with the same unchecked biases as Reynolds? Johnson tried to regain control of the conversation. We're already taking steps to address these issues. We've scheduled mandatory bias training for all officers, starting next month. Angela's expression didn't soften. Bias training is a good start, but it's not enough. This isn't just about individual prejudice. It's about a culture within law enforcement that tolerates and sometimes even rewards this behavior. Training sessions won't fix that. Ethan added, what Angela is saying is that systemic problems require systemic solutions. That means transparent investigations, independent oversight, and accountability at all levels. The administrative representative, a woman named Dr. Lillian Marks, finally spoke up. I agree with Judge Carter and Mr. Scott. If we want to restore trust in this department, we need more than quick fixes. We need to establish a citizens' oversight committee to review complaints and ensure transparency. Angela nodded in approval. That's a step in the right direction, but it can't stop there. We need comprehensive reform, from hiring practices to promotion criteria. Officers like Reynolds shouldn't just face consequences after they've caused harm. They shouldn't be hired in the first place. As the meeting progressed, Angela laid out a detailed vision for reform. She called for mandatory psychological evaluations for officers, an overhaul of training programs to include de-escalation tactics, and the implementation of body cameras with strict usage policies. Dr. Mark supported many of these suggestions, offering insights from her experience in organizational reform. Chief Johnson, though hesitant at first, gradually began to see the value in Angela's proposals. You've given us a lot to think about, he admitted. I'll admit we've been reactive instead of proactive. It's time to change that. Angela leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. Change is non-negotiable, Chief. The question is whether you'll lead it or resist it. The meeting ended with a tentative plan in place. Johnson agreed to implement many of Angela's recommendations, starting with the creation of the Citizens Oversight Committee and the immediate rollout of body cameras. But Angela knew words weren't enough. She made it clear that she'd be monitoring the department's progress and holding them accountable every step of the way. As Angela and Ethan left the station, Ethan turned to her with a small smile. You just took them to school. Angela allowed herself a brief smile in return. This isn't over, Ethan, not by a long shot. This is just the beginning. With initial reforms underway, Angela's fight for justice takes on a new dimension. She's not just holding one department accountable. She's rallying the community and confronting the larger system. But how will her message resonate with those who have suffered in silence for years? And can one woman truly challenge a system that's resisted change for decades? The next chapter will reveal the power of community and the strength of solidarity. Stay with us. Angela Carter knew that systemic change couldn't happen in a vacuum. The reforms she pushed for at the police department were just one piece of the puzzle. The real work would begin with the people, the ones who had experienced the same indignities and injustices she had, but without the platform or resources to fight back. The first step was organizing a community meeting. Angela enlisted the help of Ethan, along with her friend Dr. Lillian Marks, the administrative representative who had supported her during the confrontation with Chief Johnson. They spread the word through local organizations, churches, and social media. The response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life, Black, white, Latino, young, and old, packed the town hall, eager to share their stories and hear Angela's vision for change. Angela stood at the podium, her presence commanding yet approachable. The room was alive with energy, buzzing with conversations and quiet anticipation. She began her address with the same calm authority that had earned her respect in the courtroom. Good evening, everyone, she said, her voice carrying across the packed hall. Thank you for being here tonight. I know many of you have your own stories to tell, stories of being judged unfairly, mistreated, or ignored by a system that's supposed to protect you. The room fell silent as Angela's words hit home. She scanned the crowd, her gaze softening. I stand here not as a federal judge, but as someone who understands what it means to be treated as less than human. What happened to me was a stark reminder that no title, no accomplishment, and no amount of hard work can shield us from the biases that permeate our society. She paused, letting her words settle. Then she continued, her tone growing stronger. But we are not powerless. Every one of you in this room has the ability to drive change. Your voices, your experiences, and your persistence are the keys to dismantling the systems that have failed us. The crowd erupted into applause, a wave of emotion rippling through the room. When the applause subsided, Angela invited community members to come forward and share their experiences. The first speaker was a middle-aged black man named Marcus, who recounted being pulled over for a minor traffic violation, only to be handcuffed and searched in front of his teenage son. His voice trembled as he described the humiliation he felt and the helplessness in his son's eyes. Next, a young Latina woman named Sophia spoke about her brother, who had been arrested for loitering outside a store where he worked. "He wasn't doing anything wrong," she said, tears streaming down her face. But they didn't believe him because of how he looked. Story after story unfolded, each one a painful reminder of the systemic failures Angela was fighting to address. The room buzzed with a mix of anger and determination. People weren't just airing grievances, they were rallying together. Dr. Marks took the stage next, presenting data that backed up the community's experiences. "The numbers don't lie," she said, gesturing to a slide projected on the wall. Black and Latino individuals are disproportionately targeted by police, arrested at higher rates, and subjected to harsher treatment than their white counterparts. "This isn't about a few bad apples, it's about a broken system." Angela followed with actionable steps. "Change starts here," she said. "We need to hold our leaders accountable. We need to push for policies that prioritize de-escalation, eliminate racial profiling, and ensure transparency in law enforcement. And we need to make sure our voices are heard, at the ballot box, in city council meetings, and anywhere decisions are being made." The energy in the room was electric. People signed up for committees, volunteered to attend future town hall meetings, and pledged to support Angela's efforts. For the first time in a long time, many felt hopeful. Ethan pulled Angela aside as the meeting wrapped up. "You've started something big," he said. "But this is going to be a long fight." Angela nodded, her expression determined. "I know, but if we don't fight, nothing will change. And I'm not going to let that happen, not on my watch." With the community rallying behind her, Angela's mission gains momentum. But as her fight against injustice grows, so does the resistance from those who benefit from the status quo. How will Angela navigate the mounting pressure? And what obstacles will she face as she pushes for real systemic reform? Stick with us as this story unfolds. You won't want to miss what's next. Momentum was building. The community was energized, Angela's voice was being heard, and reforms were finally on the table. But as with all movements for justice, progress didn't come without resistance. Angela had expected pushback, but the intensity and coordination of it still managed to take her by surprise. It began subtly, with whispers in the media. Anonymous sources within the police department suggested that Angela's case was being blown out of proportion. A few op-eds argued that her arrest, while unfortunate, was a procedural misunderstanding rather than evidence of systemic racism. Others accused Angela of leveraging her position as a judge to attack law enforcement unfairly. Ethan called her one morning, his tone unusually grim. "Angela, there's an article going live tomorrow. It's a hit piece, alleging favoritism and making claims about your judicial record." Angela leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Of course there is," she said. "They can't argue with the truth, so they attack the messenger." The article dropped, painting Angela as an ambitious opportunist using her incident for personal gain. The claims were baseless, but carefully worded, designed to sow doubt and undermine her credibility. The backlash came quickly: social media debates, skeptical questions from reporters, and murmurs within the community. Ethan and Dr. Marks convened an emergency strategy meeting with Angela at her home. Ethan's frustration was palpable. "They're trying to distract from the real issue," he said, pacing the room. "If they can turn this into a debate about you, they can ignore everything else." Dr. Marks nodded. "This is classic deflection, but it's also dangerous. If they can fracture the community's support, it'll slow everything down." Angela listened quietly, her fingers steepled. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but firm. "Let them talk. The truth is on our side. I won't be silenced because they're uncomfortable with accountability." Angela's resolve was tested almost immediately. At the next community meeting, a small but vocal group of dissenters disrupted the proceedings. "Why are we targeting the police?" one man shouted. "They're just doing their jobs." Angela stepped to the podium, her presence commanding. "Sir," she said, her voice steady, "if doing their jobs means assuming guilt based on skin color, then their jobs need to change. This isn't about hating the police. It's about demanding accountability and fairness." The room erupted in applause, but the dissenters weren't satisfied. Another voice called out, "Not every cop is racist." "Why punish them all for the actions of a few?" Angela nodded, acknowledging the point. "You're absolutely right. Not every officer is racist. But this isn't about individual officers. It's about a system that allows prejudice to thrive unchecked. If we don't fix the system, good officers are left working in a broken environment." Her response shifted the energy in the room. Even those who had come with skepticism found it hard to argue with her logic and sincerity. But the resistance wasn't just verbal. Behind the scenes, Angela began receiving thinly veiled threats. Anonymous emails warned her to back off or face consequences. Ethan urged her to increase her security, but Angela refused to let fear dictate her actions. "This isn't about me," she told him. "It never was. If I back down, what message does that send to everyone who's fighting for justice?" Despite the mounting pressure, Angela's supporters rallied around her. The community meetings grew larger, with new faces showing up every week. Activists from neighboring towns joined the cause, sharing resources and amplifying Angela's message. Even some members of law enforcement began speaking out, acknowledging the need for change. The turning point came when a former officer, James Wilkins, approached Angela after one of her meetings. His face was etched with regret as he explained how he'd left the force after witnessing countless instances of misconduct. "I stayed quiet for too long," he admitted, "but seeing you fight like this, it's inspired me. I want to help." Angela thanked him, her voice thick with emotion. "Your voice is powerful, James. Sharing your story could make a real difference." James agreed, and his testimony became a rallying cry. He detailed incidents of profiling, excessive force, and a culture that discouraged accountability. His words hit hard, especially coming from someone who had worn the badge. As the movement gained traction, Angela's fight became more than a local issue. National media began covering her story, drawing attention to the broader implications of her struggle. Activists, scholars, and public figures reached out, offering support and resources. What had started as a personal fight for justice was now part of a larger movement for systemic reform. Angela remained focused. "This isn't about fame or headlines," she reminded her team. "This is about making sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." The resistance Angela faces is fierce, but so is her resolve. As the movement grows, so do the stakes. With national attention shining a light on her efforts, Angela's fight enters a critical phase. But how do you maintain momentum when the system you're challenging fights back with everything it has? And what happens when those closest to you are pulled into the crossfire? Stay tuned. This story is far from over. The national attention on Angela's fight was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it amplified her message, putting pressure on the local police department and city officials to act swiftly. On the other, it painted a target on her back. The more Angela pushed for change, the more resistance she encountered, not just from institutions, but from individuals who were determined to maintain the status quo. One evening, as Angela sat in her home reviewing notes for an upcoming community meeting, Ethan called. His voice was tense. "Angela, I just got word from a reliable source. Someone in the department leaked your home address." Angela froze. "What?" "There's chatter online," Ethan continued. "It's nothing overtly threatening yet, but people are posting about you. Where you live, where you work out, where you shop." Angela's chest tightened, but her voice remained calm. "And what are we supposed to do? Hide? Let them scare us into silence?" "No," Ethan said firmly. "But we can be smart about this. I'll arrange private security, and I think you should stay with family or friends for a while." Angela sighed. She appreciated Ethan's concern, but she wasn't ready to leave her home. "I'll think about it," she said, knowing full well she wouldn't. That same week, at a city council meeting where Angela was scheduled to speak, tensions boiled over. A small but aggressive group of protesters had gathered outside, holding signs that read, "Support the Blue" and "Stop the Witch Hunt." Their chants were loud and angry, creating an atmosphere of hostility. Inside the chamber, Angela maintained her composure. When it was her turn to speak, she rose with the confidence of someone who had spent years commanding respect in a courtroom. The room quieted as she began. "This is not a fight against the police," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It is a fight for justice, a fight for accountability, and a fight for the dignity of every individual in this community." Angela went on to outline specific policy changes she was advocating for, including independent oversight committees, mandatory de-escalation training, and measures to prevent racial profiling. Her words were met with a mix of applause and grumbles, but she didn't waver. As she finished, one of the council members, a man who had been openly skeptical of Angela's efforts, spoke up. "Judge Carter, don't you think you're painting with too broad a brush? Most of our officers are good, honest people doing a difficult job. Why should they suffer because of the actions of a few bad apples?" Angela turned to face him, her expression calm but resolute. "Councilman, I respect the work of good officers, but the phrase, 'a few bad apples,' ignores the larger truth. What happens when those bad apples are allowed to stay in the barrel? They spoil everything around them. Accountability isn't about punishing the good, it's about protecting them by removing the bad." The room erupted into applause, though the dissenters outside grew louder. As Angela left the chamber, escorted by Ethan and a few allies, the protesters jeered at her. One man shouted, "Go back to where you came from." Another hurled insults that cut even deeper. Angela didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that dignity wasn't just about how you carried yourself. It was about how you responded to those who sought to tear you down. Back at home that night, Angela allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the headlines on her phone. Ethan had texted her updates about security measures, while Dr. Marks had sent words of encouragement. Despite their support, Angela felt the weight of the fight pressing down on her. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She tensed, her mind flashing to Ethan's warning about her address being leaked. But when she peered through the window, she saw a familiar face. James Wilkins, the former officer who had become one of her strongest allies. Angela opened the door, offering him a small smile. "James, what brings you here?" James hesitated, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. "I wanted to check on you. I heard about the protesters." Angela gestured for him to come in. "I'm fine," she said, "but I appreciate you stopping by." James sat at the table with her, his expression serious. "You know, when I first joined the force, I really believed I could make a difference, that I could be one of the good guys. But the system doesn't make it easy. Speaking out, doing the right thing, it comes at a cost." Angela nodded, understanding his sentiment all too well. "And yet here you are," she said, "still fighting." James met her gaze. "Because people like you remind me that it's worth it. But Angela, you can't do this alone. You've got a lot of people standing with you, and we're ready to fight this fight too." The conversation with James reignited Angela's resolve. She wasn't just standing up to a system. She was standing with a growing movement of people who believed in her vision. The next morning, she threw herself back into the work, coordinating with activists, drafting proposals, and preparing for the next round of challenges. But Angela knew the battle was far from over. The pushback was only growing, and the stakes were higher than ever. Angela's fight has galvanized a movement, but it has also drawn fierce opposition. As the struggle intensifies, she faces not only external challenges but also personal risks that could test her limits. What happens when the fight for justice puts everything on the line? Her safety, her reputation, and even her closest relationships. Don't go anywhere. The next chapter is where the fight reaches its breaking point. Angela Carter woke to a morning she would never forget. As she sipped her coffee, her phone buzzed incessantly. Texts, calls, and notifications flooding in. Ethan's number appeared on the screen, his name glowing like a warning. "Angela," he said, his voice tense. "Check the news." Angela grabbed her laptop and opened a national news site. The headline hit her like a punch to the gut. Federal judge leading reform efforts targeted in threatening attack. Below it, images of her car, its windows shattered, and the words, "Stay silent or else," spray painted across the hood. She closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair, her heart racing. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. This was a direct message. Stop what you're doing, or face the consequences. Ethan arrived at her house within the hour, accompanied by Dr. Marks and 2 security professionals. Angela greeted them with her usual composure, but Ethan could see the weariness in her eyes. "This is an escalation," Ethan said as they gathered around her dining table. "They're not just trying to scare you, they're trying to break you." Angela nodded slowly. But they won't succeed. If anything, this proves how much this fight matters. Dr. Marks placed a hand on Angela's arm. We need to think strategically. The people who did this want to provoke you into a reaction. We can't let them dictate the narrative. Angela sighed. What's the alternative? Pretend this didn't happen? No, Ethan said firmly. But we frame it on our terms. We show the world that this kind of intimidation only strengthens our resolve. Angela agreed to hold a press conference that afternoon. By the time she arrived at the courthouse steps, a crowd had already gathered. Supporters, reporters, and even some of her detractors. Flanked by Ethan and Dr. Marks, Angela stepped to the podium, her chin held high. Good afternoon, she began, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. This morning, I became the target of a cowardly act meant to silence me. Let me be clear, I will not be silenced. The crowd erupted in applause, but Angela raised a hand, signaling for quiet. This is not just about me, she continued. This is about every person who has ever been told to stay silent in the face of injustice. This is about a system that relies on fear to maintain the status quo. Well, I'm here to say, fear will not win. Justice will. Her words resonated far beyond the courthouse steps, spreading quickly through news outlets and social media. Support poured in from across the country, civil rights organizations, lawmakers, and ordinary citizens rallying behind her. But as her platform grew, so did the scrutiny. Opposition groups doubled down, accusing Angela of using the incident for publicity. Anonymous online forums buzzed with conspiracy theories, some claiming she staged the attack herself. Angela had expected backlash, but the vitriol was exhausting. Ethan and Dr. Marks worked tirelessly to shield her from the worst of it. Focus on the mission, Ethan reminded her during one late-night strategy session. The noise is just that, noise. Stay the course. Despite their efforts, the stress began to take its toll. Angela found herself waking up in the middle of the night, haunted by the images of her vandalized car and the words scrawled across it. She threw herself into her work, but even that felt heavier than before. Meetings stretched long into the evenings, and the weight of leading the movement bore down on her shoulders. It wasn't until one quiet evening, when James Wilkins visited again, that Angela allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. You don't have to carry this alone, James said gently as they sat on her porch. You've got people who believe in you, people who are willing to stand beside you. Angela looked out at the darkened street, her voice soft. Sometimes it feels like no matter how much progress we make, the fight just keeps getting harder. James nodded. It does. But that's because you're pushing against something massive. Change is messy, and it's painful. But it's worth it. Angela's resolve began to strengthen again. She focused on the next steps, attending town hall meetings, pushing for policy reform, and continuing to build coalitions. With every setback, she reminded herself of the people who were counting on her. One pivotal moment came when Chief Johnson called her to a meeting at the station. His tone on the phone had been uncharacteristically serious. When she arrived, she was greeted by Johnson, a federal investigator, and an officer in plain clothes. We've identified suspects in the attack on your car, Johnson said, his expression grim. 2 of them are tied to a local group known for opposing police reforms. But there's more. Angela waited, her heart pounding. One of the suspects, the investigator said, is a current member of this department. The room fell silent. Angela stared at Johnson, her voice sharp. What are you doing about it? Johnson's jaw tightened. The officer has been placed on leave pending an investigation. If he's found guilty, he'll be terminated and prosecuted. That's not enough, Angela said, her voice rising. This is proof that the culture of this department is toxic. If someone on your own team feels emboldened to attack me, what does that say about your leadership? Johnson nodded slowly. You're right. We need to do more. With shocking revelations about corruption within the police department, Angela's fight reaches a critical juncture. How do you confront a broken system when it fights back from within? And what happens when justice feels further away than ever? The next chapter of Angela's journey will test her resolve, her relationships, and her ability to inspire a movement that cannot afford to fail. Stay with us. This story is far from over. Angela Carter left the meeting at the station with a fire in her chest. She had always known that change came with resistance, but learning that one of the suspects in the attack on her car was a police officer, someone sworn to uphold the law, felt like betrayal on a deeper level. The cracks in the system weren't just theoretical. They were glaring, undeniable, and far closer than anyone wanted to admit. By the time she got home, Ethan was waiting for her. He had already heard the news through his network of contacts. "This changes everything," he said, pacing in her living room, and her. "If we can prove that corruption within the department is not only systemic but actively working to silence reform efforts, it's a game changer." Angela sat down, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "It's also dangerous, Ethan. Whoever these people are, they're desperate to keep things the way they are. And desperate people do reckless things." Ethan stopped pacing and turned to face her. "That's why we don't back down. We bring this to the public. Full transparency. We can't give them room to twist the narrative." Angela nodded, but she knew the road ahead would be treacherous. The stakes had never been higher. The next morning, Angela called a press conference. She stood on the courthouse steps once again, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on her shoulders. Reporters filled the space in front of her, their cameras rolling, their pens poised. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady but firm. "I'm here today to share a critical update in the fight for justice and accountability. Law enforcement is a cornerstone of our democracy, built on trust, integrity, and the protection of all citizens. When that trust is broken, the consequences ripple through every corner of our society." She paused, letting the gravity of her words sink in. "Today I can confirm that one of the suspects in the attack on my property is an active duty police officer. This revelation is both heartbreaking and infuriating. It highlights a culture within the department that not only tolerates but protects behavior that undermines the very values it's supposed to uphold." The reporters erupted in questions, their voices overlapping. Angela raised a hand to quiet them. "I understand the outrage," she said. "I share it, but this is not a time for anger alone. This is a time for action. I am calling for an independent investigation into the department's practices, personnel, and culture. We cannot allow bad actors to hide behind the badge." Angela's announcement sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. Supporters praised her courage, while detractors accused her of trying to dismantle law enforcement entirely. The divide grew wider, and Angela found herself at the center of a national conversation about policing, accountability, and justice. But the pressure wasn't just external. Behind the scenes, Angela faced growing tensions with her own allies. Ethan and Dr. Marks urged her to stay focused on the bigger picture, while James Wilkins pushed for more aggressive action. "They're going to try to bury this," James warned during one late-night strategy meeting. "The department will promise investigations and reforms, but they'll slow-walk everything until people lose interest. You need to keep the pressure on." Angela sighed, rubbing her temples. "I'm trying, James, but there's only so much I can do at once." Ethan chimed in. "We're not just fighting the department, we're fighting public perception. If we push too hard, we risk alienating the moderates who are starting to come around to our side." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Angela knew they were both right, but the balancing act was exhausting. As the investigation into the department began, Angela received a surprising phone call from Chief Johnson. His voice was tense, but there was a hint of something else, maybe regret. "Judge Carter," he said, "I wanted to let you know personally that we've identified 2 more officers connected to the attack. They've been suspended pending further investigation." Angela's stomach churned. "And what about the officer already on leave? What action is being taken against him?" Johnson hesitated. "The internal review is ongoing, but there's something else. I've discovered evidence that suggests these officers may be part of a larger network within the department, a group resistant to reform." Angela's grip tightened on the phone. "Are you saying there's an organized effort to undermine accountability?" "I'm saying it's possible," Johnson admitted, "and it's bigger than I thought." The revelation was a bombshell. Angela immediately convened a meeting with her team to discuss their next steps. "This isn't just about rogue officers," Ethan said, his voice laced with urgency. "This is an organized effort to protect a corrupt system. We need to take this public immediately." Dr. Marks agreed. "The community deserves to know the truth, and the sooner we expose this, the harder it'll be for them to cover it up." Angela, however, was more cautious. "If we go public now, we risk tipping them off before the investigation is complete. We need evidence, something concrete that the public can't ignore." Over the next few weeks, Angela worked tirelessly behind the scenes. She collaborated with investigative journalists, connected with whistleblowers, and gathered testimony from officers willing to speak out. The stories they shared painted a damning picture of a culture steeped in racism, favoritism, and a blatant disregard for accountability. When the time was right, Angela held another press conference. This time, she didn't stand alone. James Wilkins, Dr. Marks, and 2 whistleblowers flanked her, their presence adding weight to her words. "What we're dealing with is not just a few bad officers," Angela declared. "It is a network of individuals who have actively resisted efforts to create a fair and just system. This is not just a local issue, it is a systemic one, and we will not stop until every last one of them is held accountable." With corruption exposed and a movement gaining national attention, Angela's fight enters its most perilous phase yet. But as the forces opposing her grow more desperate, the stakes become higher than ever, putting Angela and her allies directly in the line of fire. Will the pursuit of justice prevail, or will the system strike back even harder? Stay with us. The next chapter is the most critical yet. Angela Carter's fight for justice had reached a boiling point. The corruption within the police department was no longer a whisper in back rooms. It was out in the open, exposed for all to see. With public attention squarely on her efforts, Angela knew the stakes had never been higher, and neither had the risks. It began with small, insidious moves. Emails from anonymous senders accused her of bias, suggesting that her actions against the department stemmed from a personal vendetta. Social media was flooded with disinformation campaigns, twisting her words and accusing her of anti-police rhetoric. Protesters outside her community meetings grew louder and more aggressive, waving signs with slogans like "Defund Angela Carter" and "Law and Order First." Ethan kept a close watch on the escalating tensions. "This isn't just public backlash," he told Angela one afternoon. "This feels organized. Someone's pulling strings to discredit you." Angela nodded. "I know, but if they think they can scare me into silence, they're wrong. This fight is bigger than me." The resistance grew more coordinated. Angela began noticing strange cars idling near her house late at night. Journalists she had worked with reported being pressured to drop their coverage of her story. Even her friends and allies weren't spared. Ethan's office was broken into, though nothing valuable was taken, a clear message that they were being watched. One night, as Angela sat reviewing case files, her phone rang. It was Chief Johnson. "Judge Carter," he began, his voice unusually tense. "We have a situation. I thought you should know." "What is it?" Angela asked, bracing herself. "We've intercepted communications suggesting that some of the officers under investigation are planning to leak fabricated evidence to discredit you. They're desperate, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to protect themselves." Angela's heart sank. She had anticipated backlash, but the thought of her integrity being attacked with false evidence shook her to the core. The next morning, Angela held an emergency meeting with Ethan, Dr. Marks, and James Wilkins. As they gathered around her dining table, Angela shared what Johnson had told her. "They're trying to turn the tables," she said. "If they can make the public doubt me, it'll undermine everything we've worked for." Dr. Marks frowned. "This isn't just about you. It's about silencing the entire movement. If they succeed in discrediting you, it'll send a message to anyone else trying to stand up to them." Ethan leaned forward, his expression resolute. "Then we don't give them the chance. We go on the offensive. We double down on transparency and take every precaution to protect your reputation." Angela nodded. "Agreed. But we can't just play defense. We need to keep the focus on the system and the people who are trying to manipulate it." Angela and her team launched a preemptive strike. They organized a public forum, inviting journalists, community leaders, and national activists to discuss the systemic issues Angela was fighting to expose. The event was live-streamed, drawing tens of thousands of viewers. Angela stood at the podium, her voice steady but impassioned. "What we're facing isn't new. It's the same tactics used time and time again to protect power and silence dissent. But let me be clear, I will not back down. I will not be intimidated, and I will not stop fighting for a system that treats every person with dignity and respect." Her words resonated deeply, but the backlash continued to mount. That same week, a damning article appeared in a local newspaper claiming that Angela had mishandled cases during her time on the bench. The allegations were baseless, but the damage was done. Public opinion began to waver, and Angela's once unified supporters started to fracture. The attacks took a personal toll. Angela found herself increasingly isolated, her circle of trust shrinking with each passing day. Even James, who had been one of her most vocal allies, began to pull back. "It's not that I don't believe in what we're doing," he said during a tense conversation, "but I've got a family to think about. The threats, the surveillance, it's too much." Angela understood, but it still stung. She couldn't blame him for wanting to protect his loved ones, but his departure left her feeling even more alone in the fight. Despite the mounting pressure, Angela refused to give up. She worked tirelessly to rally her remaining allies, holding meetings late into the night and appearing at every public event she could. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. Her unwavering commitment inspired others to step forward, sharing their own stories of injustice and adding their voices to the movement. One pivotal moment came when a young woman named Lila approached Angela after a town hall meeting. Lila had lost her brother to police violence years earlier, and she had always been too afraid to speak out. But Angela's courage had given her the strength to finally tell her story. "You're not just fighting for you," Lila said, tears streaming down her face. "You're fighting for all of us. Don't let them win." Angela hugged Lila tightly, her resolve stronger than ever. "I won't," she promised. "Not as long as I have people like you standing with me." In the weeks that followed, Angela's movement regained its momentum. More whistleblowers came forward, and investigative journalists uncovered additional evidence of corruption within the department. Public opinion began to shift once again, and the calls for reform grew louder. But Angela knew the fight was far from over. The forces opposing her were relentless, and the stakes were higher than ever. Angela has weathered relentless attacks, but her resolve remains unshaken. With the truth finally emerging and her movement gaining strength, the fight for justice reaches a critical climax. But as the pressure mounts, so do the risks. How far will the system go to protect itself? And will Angela be able to secure the lasting change she's fought so hard for? Stay with us. This is the moment everything comes to a head. Angela Carter's battle against systemic injustice had become a movement of historic proportions. The revelations of corruption within the police department had sparked national outrage, and Angela's tireless advocacy had inspired thousands. But the forces against her were stronger than ever, willing to go to unimaginable lengths to protect their power. As the pressure mounted, Angela found herself at the center of a defining moment, not just for her, but for the entire fight for justice. The final showdown began when Angela's team received an explosive tip from a whistleblower within the department. The whistleblower, a mid-level officer named Rachel Torres, had evidence that went far beyond individual misconduct. It was a damning trove of internal emails, meeting notes, and surveillance records that revealed a coordinated effort to silence reform advocates, manipulate public perception, and shield rogue officers from accountability. "This is it," Ethan said, his voice charged with urgency as he reviewed the documents in Angela's living room. "This is the proof we've been waiting for." Angela nodded, her jaw set in determination. "We need to make this public, and we need to do it fast." But making the information public wasn't as simple as holding a press conference. The documents were complex, and Angela knew that presenting them without proper context could backfire. She and her team spent days working with investigative journalists, civil rights attorneys, and data analysts to build a comprehensive report. They cross-referenced the evidence, confirmed its authenticity, and prepared to release it in a way that would be impossible to ignore or refute. The night before the planned release, Angela sat alone in her study, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She thought of everything that had brought her to this point, the humiliation of her arrest, the threats, the relentless attacks on her character. She thought of Lila and James and the countless others who had shared their stories with her. And she thought of her late mother, who had always taught her to stand tall in the face of injustice. "This is for all of you," Angela whispered, a quiet prayer to herself as she closed her laptop. "This is for us." The next morning, Angela and her team held a press conference in the largest auditorium they could find. The room was packed with reporters, community leaders, and activists. The tension was palpable as Angela took the stage, holding a thick binder filled with the evidence they were about to present. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "What I am about to share with you is not just a story of misconduct. It is a story of systemic corruption, a deliberate effort to suppress accountability and maintain the status quo at the expense of justice and human dignity." She paused, letting the gravity of her words sink in before she continued. "These documents, provided by a brave whistleblower, expose a coordinated campaign within the police department to obstruct reform, target advocates, and protect officers who violate their oath to serve and protect. Angela walked the audience through the key pieces of evidence: emails discussing strategies to discredit her and other activists, meeting notes outlining plans to derail investigations, and surveillance records showing the targeting of whistleblowers and community leaders. Each revelation hit harder than the last, leaving the room stunned. The impact was immediate and far-reaching. News outlets across the country picked up the story, broadcasting the evidence on every major network. Social media exploded with hashtags like "We're Justice for Angela" and "Burr Reform Now," trending for days. Public outrage reached a fever pitch, with protests erupting in cities nationwide. Even lawmakers took notice. Within hours of the press conference, several prominent senators and representatives called for a federal investigation into the department's practices. Civil rights organizations mobilized, filing lawsuits and demanding sweeping reforms. But the backlash from Angela's opponents was equally fierce. Conservative media outlets dismissed the evidence as cherry-picked and accused Angela of trying to dismantle law enforcement entirely. The police union issued a scathing statement, calling her a radical activist and warning that her actions would lead to chaos in the streets. Angela refused to be intimidated. She appeared on national television, holding her ground against hostile interviewers and doubling down on her demands for accountability. "This isn't about being anti-police," she said during one particularly heated segment. "This is about being pro-justice. A system that tolerates corruption and abuse isn't protecting anyone. It's endangering everyone." As the pressure mounted, Chief Johnson finally broke his silence. In a televised address, he announced that several officers, including those involved in the attack on Angela's car, had been terminated and would face criminal charges. He also pledged to work with federal investigators to implement reforms within the department. "We failed Judge Carter," Johnson admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "And we failed this community. But that failure stops now." While Johnson's statement marked a turning point, Angela remained cautious. "Promises are easy," she told reporters. "Action is what matters, and I will not stop fighting until those promises are fulfilled." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of progress and challenges. A federal oversight committee was established to monitor the department's reforms, and several other cities announced similar investigations into their own law enforcement practices. Angela's movement inspired a wave of activism across the country, with communities organizing to demand accountability and transparency. But the fight was far from over. Angela knew that real, lasting change would require years of vigilance and relentless effort. "This is just the beginning," she told a crowd at a rally. "The road ahead is long, but together we can build a system that serves and protects us all." Angela Carter's story is a powerful reminder that one voice, when joined by many, can spark a movement. If this story has inspired you, if it has moved you to think differently about justice and accountability, then join us. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories like Angela's, and let's continue this fight together. The work doesn't end here. The system doesn't change overnight. But with people like Angela leading the way, and with all of us standing behind her, change is not just possible, it's inevitable.